Ahoy hoy, this is Michaela from Team Retroid, where we like retro games and we like the devices that bring them to us. So about a month ago, I ordered this GameSir controller off Amazon. It was a daily deal. It normally retails for about $50 and I got it for about $35. This is the GameSir G4 Pro controller. And as what typically happens when you have to adult, life gets busy, so this controller's been sitting in my office for about a good 3-4 weeks now, and I finally had time to open it up, unbox it, and do some testing on it. And it's not a perfect controller by any means, but I was actually very shocked by how versatile this controller actually is. So we're going to spend some time in this video reviewing this controller. We're going to look at all the various ways in which you can utilize it, what devices it can connect to, some of the features that I really admire about this controller, and some of the features that I either didn't like or have some constructive feedback on. Of course, we'll see how this controller applies to retro gaming and retro gaming devices, but we'll also take a look at some modern applications as well. And if you're watching this video, you probably saw this controller on Amazon or it came up on sale somewhere, and you're wondering if this controller is worth your purchase. So let's dive in, answer that question, and let's get started. Alright, let's go ahead and bust this thing open. I forgot to bring my knife into my workspace with me, so we're just going to use the trusty old fingernail. And the packaging is actually very similar to the GameSir X2 telescopic Bluetooth controller that I reviewed a while back and that I just put in my most recent giveaway. The GameSir chicken being very prominent here. And here's the controller itself. It's actually very well packaged. There's even protectors for the analog sticks, which I usually don't see when I buy controllers. For some reason, GameSir's controllers replaced their start and select with G and S buttons. And there's also some minimal branding. You see the GameSir button on the bottom is the GameSir chicken, and you see the words GameSir on top. But overall, at first hold, the controller does feel pretty nice. There's these matte grips around the edges of the controller here. There's very clear directions on the back on which color and which button combination goes to which mode. And one of the things this controller advertises is the ability to actually swap out the buttons to put them in the right order depending on which system you're on. So we're going to look at that in a little bit. If you open up the middle of the controller, you'll find a phone clip, and you'll also find a screenshot and a turbo button. I can't say I'm a big fan of where those buttons are placed because the only time you may use those buttons is when that flap is closed. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. Let's take a look at the trigger buttons here. They seem to have way too much travel for my tastes. I'm generally not a controller snob by any sense of the word, but I do want the gameplay experience to at least be comfortable, and I don't know how I feel about these triggers. The bumpers, on the other hand, are nice and responsive. I don't really have a problem with those. A, B, X, and Y seem to have exactly the right amount of responsiveness and travel, and they actually feel pretty close to an Xbox controller. They're slightly flush with the system, but they're pretty responsive, especially for removable buttons. Here's a closer look at the screenshot and the turbo buttons in the middle. You do need to lift the phone clip part of the controller in order to be able to access those. And the joysticks seem on par to a Nintendo Switch controller to me. They are pretty responsive. They do have L3 and R3. They click in. They don't stand out, but they will get the job done. This D-pad, on the other hand, just does not feel right to me. It just feels very mushy, and I'm not a fan of the design. Here's a better look at the controller as a whole, and if you actually turn it around, you'll see directions on the back as to which color and which button combination goes into which mode. And I'm really glad that the GameSir button changes color depending on mode, because The default button combination for this controller is more of an Xbox controller, so if you move the buttons to have a switch layout, you may accidentally hit the wrong button combination and end up in the wrong type of pairing mode. So let's take a look at what else you get in the packaging. You get a standard USB-C charging cable. You get some very shiny looking GameSir stickers, which I need to put these somewhere because they actually look really cool. There's a couple of warranty cards along with a QR code to direct you to their website. A letter to the purchaser. And most importantly, there's a manual here, and I actually need to look in this manual because I want to figure out how to take out the A, B, X, and Y buttons and place them back. It's supposed to be held on by magnets, so we're going to take a look at that now. And the manual is printed in different languages, but it actually does give some very important information as to how to pair this to the different devices that you may want to use it with. It specifically mentions PC, Switch, Bluetooth, and iOS in particular for Apple Arcade. But this page on the right here is what we're interested in because the unique feature about this controller is the ability to actually change the A, B, X, Y button positions. So there's a small groove on the left side of the buttons that you have to feel around for with your fingernail. And once you catch it, the button should just come right out. And it could be a little finicky just because of how recessed these buttons are, and you may have to fiddle with it for a little bit, but once you do find that groove, the buttons should come right out and you can place them anywhere they need to be placed. Usually you'll swap the X and Y buttons and you'll swap the A and B buttons. This is actually a really nice feature for somebody who has multiple consoles, and I do wish more controllers would do this in the future. So let's start with pairing this to my iPhone. I'm using my iPhone 11 Pro Max that I've had for the last couple of years, and you could see here it's pairing by me holding the GameSir button and the B button. However, it's pairing as a G4 Pro, which is what it's called. And you would think that this isn't a big deal, but I actually mispaired it and paired this to my iPhone in Android mode because the game controller's default button setup is for B to be where A is now. Now if we go ahead and try to put the phone into the clip with a rugged case on or a heavier case, it's either not going to fit or it's going to fit loosely and fall off. So you are going to have to take your phone case off in order to use this clip. You could see here with my UAG case on, the phone just falls right out the second I go to play. But once I took it out of the case and put it into the clip, there were no problems. It sat right in perfectly and there didn't seem to be any danger of it falling out. However, because I mispaired the controller, Genshin Impact did not realize that I had a controller connected, and I'm on iOS, so this does have native controller support. So I had to go right back in and repair it in iOS mode, and it showed up on my iPhone as an Xbox wireless controller. And then once I jumped right back into Genshin Impact and went into my settings, I was able to switch to a controller layout. And everything seemed to just work from there. Now since my iPhone thinks that this is an Xbox One controller, let's go ahead and swap out the buttons to match so that way what I'm actually pressing on the controller matches what's on the screen. And this is a bit of a frustrating extra step, but other controllers don't give you this option, so it's a nice one to have. Just be careful not to lose the buttons as you're swapping them out. Now, I'm having a hard time getting into Genshin Impact. You could see I'm very early on in the game. I haven't even hit Adventure Rank 20 yet, which caused me to miss out on getting Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn in this game. And I've probably also missed a ton of other characters and events since then. So whenever I have a few minutes, I try to give this game the old college try and play it for a little bit. And I've tried a bunch of different things. I've tried a Razer Kishi, I've tried an Xbox controller with a clip. For some reason, this GameSir controller was finally where it clicked for me. And even though I'm a little upset I have to take my phone case off, for some reason playing Genshin Impact this way just felt right. And I wish I could necessarily explain why that is, but you could see in this footage here, I'm just tearing through these monsters. And I really wish I could explain why it is that this controller makes me want to play Genshin Impact. It might just be because it's a regular controller and not a touchscreen and not a telescopic controller. If you do pair this controller with an iOS device, it also makes a good companion for Apple Arcade. Here's Asphalt 8 Plus. And most Apple Arcade games do have native controller support, so you can use this controller if you have an iOS device. And you don't necessarily even need to use the clip. You can just prop your phone up on a stand. I'm using a Wii U stand here. And you can also play the games this way. Now, I'm not noticing very much input lag at all. In fact, this seems to be pretty responsive. And I know that is a concern when using Bluetooth to connect a controller, but if there is lag here, I haven't really noticed it. Then again, I'm also not very sensitive to input lag unless it's really bad, so you could be watching this and saying, "Hey, Mikhailov, that actually looks really bad." But from my point of view, I'm able to play a game like Dead Cells here on my iPad, and that's one of the major selling points for this controller is it can be used on pretty much anything. But it's not awkward like the GameSir X2 telescopic controller or the Razer Kishi. It just works as a regular controller and it feels pretty decent. So if you're looking for a controller that works with an iOS device, this could very well be a decent one. Let's try some game streaming here through Steam Link, and in this case, the GameSir button actually functions as the Steam button. And I did have to go into controller configurations and just import a generic controller profile. But once I did that, this game, Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion, which has controller support, seemed to work just fine. Again, the iPad thinks that this is an Xbox controller, so it's going to show up on screen as though I were playing with an Xbox controller. And granted, this isn't the most intensive of games. I'm not really big on first-person shooters or anything like that, but everything seems responsive and seems to work just fine. So if you were going to use this controller to do some game streaming, looks like that wouldn't be an issue. Alright, let's set this up for Nintendo Switch. We're going to switch the buttons back around so that they match the button layout for this system. Now the pairing setup for Nintendo Switch is to hold down the GameSir button and Y, but just remember it's not actually Y you're hitting, it's Y on an Xbox controller. So I accidentally put this into X input mode, so we're going to have to shut the controller off. And we're going to have to actually hit the GameSir button and X so that the light is blinking red. And once that happens, we'll be in Switch mode and we can pair. In addition to hitting the GameSir and X button, you're also going to need to hold the G and S button until the light starts blinking rapidly. That will put the controller into pairing mode. And then just give it a couple of minutes and it should register on the Switch as a Pro controller. And then once it's paired, you should be able to just jump right into a game and start playing. So I didn't notice any issues when playing a Switch game. I booted up Pokemon Legends Arceus and there was no problem whatsoever. And you can use the screenshot button under the phone clip in order to take screenshots or record videos on a Nintendo Switch, but it's really odd that that's where they decided to place the button. It's just super inconvenient to get to. A really odd thing happened when I went to go play Nintendo 64 games using the Nintendo Switch Online app. The rumble in the controller would not stop. It just kept going. You could see the controller is rumbling so hard that it's actually moving on my desk. And I don't know why that is, but it was persistent across all Nintendo 64 games. It didn't matter which Nintendo 64 game I was playing, whether it was Zelda or Star Fox, it just kept rumbling the second a game booted up. So during the course of my testing, I actually had to go into the Switch settings and I had to turn controller vibration to off. And that was able to temporarily fix the problem. I was able to go into a Nintendo 64 game like Ocarina of Time and I was able to use this controller normally. But now I'm not going to be able to take advantage of any rumble function that might be built into any of these games. And the only solution I could think of to fix this would be to use the GameSir app on either iOS or Android and attempt to update the firmware. So we're going to try to do that off camera, and I'll caption or notate in this part of the video if that actually fixed the problem. However, if you're going back into the Genesis, SNES, and NES parts of Nintendo Switch Online, you're not going to have a problem because there is no rumble in those games. And we're just going to jump into a quick fighting game here on Nintendo Switch. This is Capcom Arcade Classic Street Fighter 2. And I'm playing with just the D-pad here on purpose so I can show you just how much I really don't like this D-pad. It's decent for games that require only the occasional push, but you can see here I am not making any combos, I'm not getting any special moves off, and I'm just generally having a very bad time trying to use this D-pad to play a fighting game. And when I switched back to the joystick, I started doing marginally better. And I don't know what kind of membranes or anything are underneath this D-pad, but to me it just does not feel good and it does not perform great. So before doing commendations and condemnations on this controller, I wanted to really put it through its paces and just try to find a bunch of different scenarios in which I can use this controller. So I started with a personal favorite, the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, and this can connect through Bluetooth in Android mode. And one thing that I thought was really cool is that the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus does fit in the phone clip pretty decently, as long as you make sure you're not touching the volume rocker up top. And it turned out to be a surprisingly viable way to want to play the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus if you felt like holding a regular controller. However, you do need to go into the various emulators and configure it. So I'm going to show some footage of this device as well as other devices I connected this controller to, and we're just going to do some B-roll here, and we're going to pick some sick music from Now the Nightmare to go with it. So go ahead and enjoy, and I'll be back in a couple minutes. One thing I just wanted to note about the Amazon Fire Stick is I did run into some weird compatibility issues. I actually had to connect in iOS mode. Despite this being an Android-based device, I don't know why it wouldn't accept any other Bluetooth connection. And then it had this weird issue where the right stick would stick and I couldn't do anything with any games requiring the right stick. And even if I didn't use these standalone emulators and I tried to play older games in RetroArch, the controller just seemed a lot more sensitive than when I tried to use the other devices, and it made games like F-Zero unplayable. There may be fixes and tweaks for this, but it made this controller unplayable on the Fire Stick for me. Alright, let's wrap things up with Commendations and Condemnations. So here's what's good about this controller. I really do like the swappable A, B, X, and Y buttons. This means that you can use this controller on pretty much anything without having to get confused as to which button does what. And that applies to the universal theme that actually goes with this controller. You can pair it to pretty much anything. You can do an Android or iOS device, you could connect this to a PC with the 2.4 GHz dongle, and you can even go into retro devices like Raspberry Pis. It's just a very well-rounded controller. And on top of it, it's actually very comfortable to hold, so it makes me want to use this controller for all of those systems. A lot of that has to do with the size, design, and grippiness. Like I said earlier, it made games that I've been having trouble getting into, like Genshin Impact, easier to play. However, that said, I also do have a couple of pretty serious condemnations about this controller. And I'm not going to talk about the issue I had with the rumble here because that may be fixed in a firmware update. However, the issues that are hardware based and cannot be fixed are the L2 and R2 button travel, as well as that poor D-pad design. You don't want to play fighting games using that D-pad. I was hoping that the phone grip would be strong enough that I wouldn't have to take my case off my iPhone, but that unfortunately was not the experience that I had had. And it is inconvenient to access that screenshot button if you are playing on a Nintendo Switch. Accessing that button is terribly inconvenient unless you play with the phone grip flipped up, and you probably don't want to do that. I also had to take some points off due to the compatibility issues I had with some devices like the Fire Stick. However, these condemnations, as much as I'm making a big deal out of them, they're actually not deal breakers for me. I actually still enjoy using this controller. And if you do decide to add this controller to your collection, I think you'll be pretty pleased with it too. Just because of all the options it does have. It really is a one-stop shop for controllers if you have multiple systems that you play on. Alright, that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts in the comments below, and feel free to continue the conversation in the Budget Aquaman Discord. Link is in the video description. And if this video was helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.